Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on a rather cold and unpleasant night. I can move it a little closer too. Is that better? Better? Okay. Good evening again. Also, good evening to everyone who's watching the live stream of this. Welcome to another installment of our Lonergan lecture series. Tonight, our topic is going to be whether there is salvation outside of the church. A brief book recommendation before I begin. This talk is very much indebted to a book called Salvation Outside the Church, ? By Francis Sullivan, a Jesuit priest. This is the book that I used for researching this talk. It is also the book that I pulled all the many quotations that are in this talk from. So, thank you very much to Father Sullivan. It's a book that I recommend to all of you if you have questions after this talk, or if you are interested in learning more about our topic. So, is there salvation outside of the church? If we're going to discuss this question, I think it would help all of us to begin in a very philosophically grounded way, which involves us defining our terms. What do we mean by salvation? If we're asking whether or not you can have salvation in one place or another, we probably need to know what we're asking about in the first place. When salvation is used, at least in a theological context, it refers to something that needs saving. It means something like our being fixed by God, our being redeemed or atoned for by God. More theologically technical words, at least for the context in which I'll be discussing this tonight, a context which I'll say a little bit more about in a brief moment. I'll be treating salvation as that thing which we required to become unified with or to come into union with God. So basically, within the broad tradition of the church, I'm going to use that word broad and in a way that hasn't do a lot of work for me because there's a lot of different thoughts on this, but broadly speaking, in the tradition of the church, there is this idea that all of us as human persons require some kind of making right with God. And salvation, again, very broadly, very generally understood, as there's a lot of different interpretations of this word, there's a lot of different meanings that are attached to this word, is understood to be that thing which makes right for us with God. So, to that context that I wanted to talk about, there's a very big word up on the screen, soteriology. That should be understood merely as the theology of sin and salvation. That is, an understanding of how it is God arranges for sinful human beings to be saved, to be redeemed. I bring this discipline of theology up again because there's lots of disagreements within the church about how we ought to understand what sin is, what counts as sin, how it is we come to sin, how it is God redeems us, whether this way of redeeming us was necessary, whether this event was necessary for redemption. So I mention that there's this entire theological discipline to say that I cannot answer to every single idea within the church's tradition. I can't answer to every single idea that comes up even within a century of discussion in the church's tradition related to the question of redemption, related to the question of salvation. So, the context that I'm going to give you is to place you, again, very generally speaking, within the part of the tradition that I'm engaging with, that I'm working with. So to do that, I'm going to give you a few basic assumptions that I'll be relying upon tonight. That is, I'm addressing a part of the tradition that holds to these assumptions. I was thinking of you, Father Roy, when I was writing this out, because I know you disagree with parts of this tradition, specifically with the part of the tradition that requires there to be a sacrifice that God has to make unto himself. But since that's the part of the tradition that is very much interested in this question of whether there's salvation outside the church, and also provides us with some of the I'll say, strictest interpretations of how we ought to understand what it means to be saved within or without the church, that's the part I'm going to be addressing. So, what does this part of the tradition hold? This tradition holds that first, all of us have the mark of original sin. That is, all of us need, to use my non-technical language from earlier, a making right with God. None of us are perfect in the eyes of God. None of us are fully good in the eyes of God. If we were in a soteriology class, we would then go on to discuss what caused original sin. We'd talk about whether or not there should be a literal or an analogical or an allegorical or a mythological reading of the Genesis stories, but that would take a very long time, so we're not doing that. We just need to understand, for the purposes of tonight, that the part of the tradition I'm addressing believes that there is an original sin that makes us, in the eyes of God, in need of fixing, redemption, salvation. Another basic assumption is that Jesus' suffering makes right with God. We're going to talk more about this in a second as well, but that there is a need for an atonement, that God's justice requires something to be given to him, to be given up to him, to make up for our sin, and that something is the suffering of Jesus. The last thing I have on the screen, anti-Pelagianism, is a reference to a particular heresy that pops up fairly constantly in the church's history. Pelagius was an ancient church father who held to, among other ideas, a version of the belief that we are able to make right with God through our own actions. There are many different versions of Pelagianism. It is combated in almost every era of the church's existence because it pops up in different versions. What I mean by this is that we are accepting, for the purposes of this talk, we are taking as given that we are not able as human persons to do enough to sufficiently make right with God or sufficiently atone for our sins with God, that we need something external to us in order for us to be able to be unified with God. To put in common parlance, in order for us to be able to be in heaven. There has to be something outside of us provided by God that brings us into a state where we're able to enter heaven. I realize that there's a lot of complicated theological stuff going on here. This is just to set the stage. It will hopefully get easier as we move forward. That's the end of our aside. Let's talk about salvation. So, when we talk about a need for us to be made right with God, a need for us to be made more perfect, to be made perfect in the eyes of God, what is it in the church's tradition that is seen as the cause of us being made right? Well, that's not a question that there's an easy answer to. If you haven't gathered anything else so far into this talk, you should have noticed that everything is incredibly complicated and complex and there are no easy answers. That's unfortunately going to be true for the rest of the night. My apologies. But when we talk about causation, most of the time we think about it to use an image associated with David Hume, who's a famous Scottish philosopher who denies causation is a thing, which is not important for tonight's talk. Hume talks about billiard balls, a pool table. You have a stick, the stick hits the cue ball hits another ball, they ricochet around. We think about causation like Hume's, as behaving like Hume's billiard table. One thing hits another thing, that thing hits another thing, that thing hits another thing. It's a progressive series of events. But causation can be a little bit trickier than that. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say on your way here tonight, one of you got into a car accident. I could ask, what was the cause of that? Now, you could say it was the black ice on the road. Or you could say you got into the accident because the other driver didn't get out of the way when they saw your car careening toward them. Or you could say you got into the accident because you decided to come to my talk tonight instead of staying in your nice warm homes. Or you could say you got into the accident because several decades ago your parents met and they fell in love and they had a child, and that child would one day grow up to get in a car and drive to a talk. We can talk about the billiard ball that hits the other billiard ball, or we can talk about the cue stick that hit the cue ball, that hit the first billiard ball, that hit the second, that hit the third, or we can talk about the person that built the cue stick, or we can talk about the person that cut down the tree that gave the wood to the person who built the cue stick. So causation isn't always easy for us to assess. When we're talking about salvation, there's a similar bunch of twisted causes that can all be assigned some responsibility, if that's the right word, to our being saved. But to try and pull apart this Gordian knot, to make it a little more comprehensible, let's talk about two causes. Let's talk about causation in two ways. First, we'll talk about it generally, universally, and second, we'll talk about it in relation to an individual, that is, particularly. So the general cause of salvation is Jesus' becoming a human, the incarnation. Now, the reason I said the incarnation and not something like Jesus' suffering on the cross or Jesus' resurrection is because there's medieval theologians hiding in the shadows waiting to stab me if I say the wrong thing. This is something generally agreed upon in the tradition, that regardless of what happens once Jesus is incarnate, his becoming human, his taking on our form, his taking on humanity and bringing it in union with God, is how we are saved. And then there's lots of fighting about all the other details. So in general, we need God to become man to be saved. But what about for us individually? Is it enough for me? Is it enough for Father Pat? Is it enough for Anne just for there to be a small child showing up in a manger in Bethlehem? Well, not necessarily. Something has to happen from the incarnation. And at least, again, in the eyes of a large part of that tradition that speaks of salvation, that something is grace. That is, Jesus' becoming man allows for each of us to receive from God a gift that makes us more perfect, that takes away that original sin that is built into us, that we have merely because we are human. I have in parentheses up there sanctifying grace. There are different kinds of grace. Sanctifying grace is the one that's relevant to what we're talking about, but there's also other ones that are kind of relevant sometimes. So we'll just use grace for short. But what's important here, Jesus becomes a human person. That then opens to us the opportunity of receiving the kind of grace that we need to be justified, made right, redeemed in the eyes of God, the just judge. But how do we get this grace? And this is really where we first are going to begin to interact with the overriding question we have for tonight, namely, is there salvation outside of the church? So grace sanctifies, grace redeems us, grace makes us better, but where does it come from? Well, it's a divine gift. It comes from God. Great. How does God give it to us? And here is where you are going to start to see why the church is seen by the tradition as important in this process of salvation. Now, the church teaches that for us to receive grace, we have to be what's called properly disposed. They're using a particular scholastic word here, disposition. We can think of it as having the right attitude, or as acting in such a way so that we can accept the grace that God offers us. Okay, so there's something we have to do. But it's not like grace is available, on some readings of how grace is made available, behind every door. It's not like it's under everyone's chair like you are at a showing of Oprah tonight. So, where does it come from then? The church holds that the sacraments provide us grace. Specifically, the sacrament of baptism provides the kind of grace that is relevant to salvation, and also that we can have grace made available to us through the right teaching of the magisterium of the church. Well, if grace comes from us knowing the right things and then believing them, or if grace is made available through those things, and if grace is made available through the sacraments, well, what can both provide the sacraments and teach us rightly? At least in the eyes of the church, the answer to that question is the Catholic Church. So here is sort of the beginnings of why it is that the question of the church being central to our salvation is going to begin to be a little more clear. It's because the things by which we get saved, or more properly put, the things we need to be saved, come from the church, as much of the tradition describes this process. But there's more to the question of whether or not there's salvation outside of the church than just, well, we need grace, and grace is made available through these particular things, and these things just so happen to be things that the church has. Here's where we get to the part of this lecture tonight where I read off lots of quotations to you. Some I'll read directly because I think they're important. Some I'll try and paraphrase because they're very long. But what I'm going to try and do is provide you a historical overview of this question within the tradition. You will notice, hopefully, as we go through some of these quotations, that this question isn't a singular question, that there are multiple different groups the different voices in the tradition have in mind when they ask, are these people able to be saved outside the church, or are these people even outside the church in the first place? What I'd hope to do as we start discussing the ways in which the tradition has said, here's why the church matters, or here are some people that might not be in the church, or here are some people that might actually be in the church, even if they don't know they are, what I hope for us to be able to observe, to be able to take out of all of this discussion, is that there first have been changes in how the church has addressed this question and responded to this question, and second, that some of these changes were reliant upon things that some of the earlier voices in the church just didn't know about. As I have mentioned to many of you in the past, and as I'm sure Father Pat could quote from memory, which I'm not going to be able to do, St. John Henry Newman, the namesake of this Newman Center, said that the church's teaching constantly evolved. And in particular, Newman said that evolution was prompted by wrong belief, that the church didn't really ever decide anything until she realized someone had decided the wrong thing and it needed correction. But Newman was very aware of this process of, call it, response and correction that happens for hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of years. And he uses the word evolution as well, that there are apparent changes in what is said, that what was once believed to be true is added to, is clarified later on. And that's what I hope all of you are going to be able to note as we start working through what the tradition has to say about salvation inside or outside the church, that there is this notable, there is this obvious process of evolution that occurs. And we need to think about what the historical context was that first might have prompted, might have caused that change, that clarification. And second, whether or not there might be any of those historical contextual things today that could again prompt for an improvement, a clarification, a development in our understanding of what it means for there to be salvation inside or outside the church. List up here of several different church councils, papal bulls. This is a kind of writing that the popes might issue that all address this question. You will notice that many of these, that all of these, happen over 1,000 years into the history of the church. That is not accidental. This question was heavily debated. Once it began being debated, which was roughly 100 to 150 years after the founding of the church, it was heavily debated for centuries. The fact that there was no clear ruling on it at an ecumenical council, like the Fourth Lateran Council, or by a pope, is something that is directly related to the amount of disagreement among respected theologians, among respected teachers in the church. So, just in that historical fact, we can see that there is something like evolution happening. There wasn't a clear response that the church was confident in giving for, well, 1,200 years. So after those 1,200 years elapsed, what did the church say? At the Fourth Lateran Council, it was written in the council documents that, quote, "There is one universal church of the faithful outside of which no one at all is saved," unquote. Similarly, in Unum Sanctum and in the other papal bull that's up there that I'm not going to try and pronounce, there is a reiteration of this idea that it is only within the church that persons can be made right with God and saved. Also at the Council of Florence, an ecumenical council as well, it was said that the Holy Roman Church believes, professes, and teaches that none who are outside of the Catholic Church, neither pagans nor Jews, nor heretics, nor schismatics, can become sharers of eternal life. These are all very stark statements of what seems to be an incredibly limiting doctrine, namely that anyone who is not a Christian, and not just a Christian, but the right kind of Christian and the right kind of church, goes to hell. Indeed, in the Council of Florence, it says that list that I just read off, the pagans, the Jews, the schismatics, the heretics, will go into eternal fire. It directly references, I believe, Matthew's gospel with the discussion of the devil and the angels and burning and worms in fire. It's not a pleasant image to think of, that the all-loving God has a list of people, like some kind of angry cosmic Santa Claus, who instead of receiving coal, just go directly into the burning furnace. But this was presented as the teaching of the church at a council that gathered the entire church together. One other thing worth mentioning, it affirms this doctrine. It is from a papal address, I believe is of Pius IX, more recently, so in the 1850s, which begins, "We must hold as of the faith that out of the apostolic Roman Church there is no salvation, that she is the only ark of safety, and whosoever is not in her perishes in the deluge," in the flood, a reference to Noah's ark. But then the Pope continues in his address to the faithful who are meeting with him on this day. "We must also, on the other hand, recognize with certainty that those who are invincible in ignorance of the true religion are not guilty for this in the eyes of the Lord," end quote. Pope Pius here is presenting a very different, not even image, but a very different teaching than we saw in the earlier papal bulls and the earlier ecumenical councils. Yes, he affirms there's no salvation outside the church, but he doesn't rush to say, therefore, everyone who's not in the church will burn in hellfire. Rather, he says, there are some outside of the church who are not seen as guilty and so meriting punishment by God. This is the evolution of doctrine that Newman speaks of. It's something that, as we will see, is very much in line with some of the beliefs of the most ancient teachers, the most ancient church fathers. It is also something that at some times is abandoned in what the church teaches, and in other times is emphasized in what the church teaches. In the book that I mentioned, the Jesuit priest Sullivan talks about a particular member of his order. It's something that Father Pat and I have talked about. I believe his name was Father Finney. Leonard Feeney, thank you. Feeney was actually excommunicated from the church and removed from the Jesuit order for his insistence that no salvation outside the church meant no salvation outside the church, that everyone who was not a Roman Catholic went to hell. Later on in his life, Feeney was unexcommunicated. He was brought back into the church through a work of a local bishop, and then also, I believe, one of his brother Jesuits. However, what Sullivan, the author of the book, brings up is this. Feeney is articulating what seems to be an accurate reading of what we saw in the ecumenical councils and in the teachings of multiple popes. And yet he was kicked out of the church for saying it. He also may have been excommunicated because he called a bishop a heretic, but we'll leave political considerations aside. And so Sullivan's question is this: how could a Jesuit in good standing be removed from the Catholic faith, be removed from his religious order for saying the exact thing that all the bishops of the church, that multiple popes of the church themselves said? In other words, how is it that we make sense of popes saying there's no salvation outside the church and people go to hell, and popes saying, like Pope Pius did, there's no salvation outside the church, but God does not judge everyone who's outside of the church. There are some who there may be a possibility of salvation open for. How do we make sense of these? This is Sullivan's question in his book, and this is the same question that we will consider tonight. If the literal reading of those ecumenical councils and papal bulls is not the right reading, which we have reason to doubt it is the right reading, the excommunication of Finney, the fact that we have other popes saying things that seem to contradict this, what is the right reading? To answer that question, well, we have a little more work to do. In the Bible, I'm going to reference a few passages. These are not at all exhaustive on the question of whether or not the church is the only way to be saved. In Matthew's gospel, we have Jesus telling Simon Peter, "You are the rock upon which I will build my church, and I give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. What you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. What you bind on earth will be bound in heaven." There's authority that is granted to Peter as head of what? As head of the church. An authority that the church will claim to herself in the following centuries. In John's gospel, you have Jesus saying, "I am the gate for the sheep to enter. Any who came before me are thieves and robbers. They climbed over the walls of the sheepfold, but I am the gate and the good shepherd. I bring the sheep in." At the end of this passage, Jesus says, "I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd." Also in John's gospel, a more famous passage, Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." And then lastly, in Acts, in the 4th chapter of Acts, Peter addresses the people. Peter addresses some of the Jewish authorities. Someone got healed. The Jewish authorities got mad and want to know how he got healed, and were also angry at the apostles because they were talking about Jesus. And Peter says, "Well, let it be known to all of you and to all of the people of Israel that this man is standing before you in good health by the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, whom you crucified, whom God raised from the dead. There is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among mortals by which we must be saved." So while we don't have a direct statement of extra ecclesiam nulla salus, there's no salvation outside the church within the Bible, which we wouldn't expect because that's a Latin phrase and the Bible's not written in Latin originally, we do at least have passages that hint at the authority of the church, the exclusivity of Jesus's church, and the necessity of the acceptance of Jesus, of belief in Jesus for salvation. So how did the early church deal with this question? How did the earliest teachers in the church, the earliest authorities in the church, try and make sense of these biblical demands of authority, the biblical demands of belief in Jesus, these biblical demands of Jesus being the way to God? Well, generally speaking, and this applies to all of the persons that I have listed up there, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Clement of Alexandria, the early church was much more concerned with what we'll call schismatics. Christians who didn't belong to the right group of Christians. Christians who said something that what biblical, or some biblical and early Christian scholars call the proto-Orthodox believers, that is, the people who think the stuff that we, or the majority of the Christian tradition, thinks now. The early church was concerned with people who didn't believe what the proto-Orthodox thinkers did. They were concerned with the groups of Christians that broke away from, hence schismatics. There was a schism, a breaking away, a separation, who broke away from groups led by the apostles, groups founded by apostles. We see actually even before these thinkers, well before them, in the letters of Paul, that there's a worry about schismatics. Paul criticizes people who believe in a gospel that was not delivered by him, that was not the gospel of Jesus. He tells them to be wary of false prophets. So in the early church, there's a concern with not people outside of the church, but within the church, whether people belong to the right church. And that consideration leads to the formulation that we are now familiar with of no salvation outside the church. That is to say, there is a belief that those who break away from the church that traces back to Jesus, the church that was founded by and cared for by the apostles, those persons would not be saved. Hopefully, this makes you have a few questions. Because this isn't addressing, like we saw in one of the earlier paper bowls, the pagans. It's not addressing, as we'll see in some of the later thinkers, the Jews or the Muslims who don't believe in the Christian God. It's not really even addressing heretics yet, as heresy requires a unified church that has some way of promulgating this is not the right thing to believe. The first councils that define heresy don't happen for hundreds of years after the 2nd century CE. So what we're really talking about here are just breakaway groups of believers that are reading the wrong gospels, or that are talking about the gospels in the wrong way, or that are living their lives in the wrong way. And these are the persons being told to come back, to live better, to believe better, and so to be saved. This is the original worry present in the earliest Christian churches. A worry about those persons who followed false apostles, who read false gospels, and who so removed themselves from following the way, the truth, and the life in Jesus. We see this same thing carry forward into the 3rd and to the 4th century. However, something interesting happens as we get into the 4th century. For those of you who know your history, Christianity early on is a Jewish cult. That is, it's part of the Jewish religion that has a few kind of importantly different beliefs, namely the arrival of the Messiah, his death and his resurrection. This Jewish cult, though, is one that has some problems with authority. Specifically, authorities in Jewish Jerusalem before the Roman occupation and destruction of Jerusalem, and later on, during a few periods, with the Roman government itself. Now, Christians were sometimes persecuted because they were convenient scapegoats. During the Great Fire in Rome, Nero decides to kill Christians because he needs to blame someone, and, well, why don't we blame these few little Jewish persons that nobody really likes, and who might do weird things, like be cannibals. Nero capitalizes on the fact that Christians aren't super well known, and also that there is some animus towards them, specifically in Jewish communities. Later on, we will see targeted persecutions of Christians. But all of this stops around the 4th century, when Christianity first has not an official recognition by the Roman Empire, but at least protection given to it by the Roman Empire. And then later on, when Christianity is adopted by Constantine as the official religion of the Roman Empire. And suddenly, when Christianity stops being small little churches, small little local communities that have to be afraid of religious and secular authorities around them, and becomes a state religion, we see a shift in how Christians talk about salvation. Here is an example. John Chrysostom, so a late 4th century thinker, quote, "One should not think that ignorance excuses the non-believer. When you are ignorant of what can easily be known, you have to suffer the penalty. So do not say, how is it that God has neglected that sincere and honest pagan? You will find that he has not been diligent in seeking the truth, since what concerns the truth is now clearer than the sun," unquote. All of a sudden, when Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, Christians stop being concerned with, well, you left my church, or you're not listening to Peter, or you're not listening to Paul, and now become concerned with everyone who's non-Christian. And Christians start talking about those non-Christians as being sinful, as being pagans, in a problematic, in a pejorative sense of the word, as being persons who will be judged by God and who will be damned by God because of their unbelief. I mentioned historical fact, historical context earlier. This is an incredibly striking moment of that context seemingly affecting, if not doctrine yet, at least the established beliefs of church communities. This same belief carries its way into the medieval period. You'll have to forgive me for doing very bad history here. I recognize there's an 800-year gap between the two figures I'm talking about. They're two very important figures. There are also two figures that are referenced, if not exclusively, exceptionally often in what follows them. Also, well, I had to have a time limit on this presentation, so you're getting someone in the 400s and someone in the 1200s. Augustine, who many of you will know is also famous for first really articulating fully the doctrine of original sin, which, as if you recall from earlier, is a very important part of this entire question of salvation. Augustine says, "Whoever is separated from this Catholic Church by this single sin of being severed from the unity of Christ, no matter how estimable a life he may imagine he is living, shall not have life, but the wrath of God rests upon him." Well, what does it mean to be separated from the church? Also from Augustine. "If, as truth itself tells us, no one is delivered from the condemnation that we have incurred through Adam except through faith in Jesus Christ, and yet those people will not be able to deliver themselves from the condemnation, who will be able to say that they have not heard the gospel of Christ, since faith comes through hearing. Therefore, neither those who have never heard the gospel of Christ, nor those who by reason of their infancy were unable to believe, are separated from that mass which will certainly be damned." Augustine says, if you don't hear about Jesus, or if you're a baby, you're going to hell, because you couldn't hear the gospel and you couldn't respond rightly to the gospel. That is, you couldn't believe that Jesus is Lord. Augustine is, again, incredibly clear about what he believes. There's a very small little group that gets to go to heaven, and Augustine actually expands the group of those who can't. He's no longer just concerned with schismatics. He is obviously including here, he explicitly states he is including in the group of persons who are not saved, anyone who is not a Christian, and anyone who hears the message of the gospel and does not explicitly believe it. This belief, even though I don't have people for the next few hundred years listed up there, is actually continued. It's one of the reasons why this jump happens, because Augustine's belief is accepted. That if you don't expressly believe in the gospel, believe in Jesus, you're going to hell. Why? Because Augustine thought that everyone would have heard about Christianity. Again, the shift that happens when Christianity goes from being a small breakaway from the Jewish religion to the state religion of Rome, Rome is the world. So how could you have not heard about Jesus when Rome is everything that there is, and Rome carries with it the message of the Gospels? So obviously, Augustine reasons, you must just be a sinful wretch if you don't believe in Jesus, because you had to have heard of him, and every good person who hears about him believes in him, unless they're a baby. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, in the 1200s, similarly carries forward this Augustinian idea that if you don't believe in Jesus, it's not because you never heard of Jesus, it's just because you're not a good person. It's because you heard it and you didn't change your life, you didn't convert yourself. So Augustine says, now the unity of the church primarily depends on the unity of faith, for the church is nothing other than the congregation of the faithful. Since it is impossible to please God without faith, there can be no place of salvation other than in the church. Furthermore, the salvation of the faithful is consummated through the sacraments of the church. So we see here in Thomas the idea that we need the church for salvation because of, say, the sacraments providing for us. But Thomas, like Augustine before him, claims you cannot be saved if you are not a member of the Catholic Church. What does he mean by that? You are a person who hears the gospel and who accepts it. Does everyone hear the gospel? Yes. Thomas actually introduces an interesting thought experiment. What if you are a child raised by wolves in the wilderness? Are you saved or are you damned? Well, this is what Thomas has to say. Quote, if anyone were brought up in the wilderness or among brute animals, provided that he followed his natural reason in seeking the good and avoiding evil, we must most certainly hold that God would either reveal to him by an inner inspiration what must be believed, or would send a preacher to him, as he sent Peter to Cornelius, end quote. Thomas thought it was impossible for anyone to not have heard the gospel, and so Thomas held that anyone who did not believe in what the church taught could not be saved. Because he thought that even if you were, I think there was a child in France a couple hundred years ago who was stuck out in the wilderness and they rescued him. They had to teach the kid language. Even if you were that kid, Thomas thought God would either reveal to you by some direct revelation what you needed to know to be a part of the church, or God would arrange through providence to send you a preacher. Speaking of historical context, something very important happens a couple hundred years after the death of Thomas. Namely, the age of exploration in Europe begins. And what happens during the age of exploration but a bumbling Italian who renounces his Italian citizenship, which is something that bothers me intensely. Italians should not claim Columbus. He renounced his citizenship to get money from Spain. Unacceptable, unforgivable. Also not what we're talking about. But a bumbling Italian explorer bumps into some islands in the Atlantic Ocean, thinks he made it to India, names them the Indies, and encounters what? A group of persons who never heard the gospel before because they were not in the known world. All of a sudden, the medieval conceit that everyone had heard the gospel because the gospel was everywhere is shattered by the discovery of the new world. These are persons who never had a chance to hear about God because literally no missionary ever arrived there. So what do you do with the inhabitants of the new world? This becomes quite a vexing problem for the church. Because while it's easy to say, well, these evil heretics are obviously not going to heaven, or these Muslims that we have been fighting wars with for hundreds of years are not going to heaven, or these Jews that unfortunately most of Europe hates for a very long time aren't going to heaven because they're Jews. Now all of a sudden you're met with a group of people you don't have an easy reason, a ready reason to dismiss. Now all of a sudden you're met with persons that seem rather innocent of any crime, of any sin. And yet the prevailing belief of the medievals was that those persons would go to hell because God would have provided them a way to know the gospel and they did not accept it. What we see in the modern period is a gradual realization that the medieval conceit that traces its way back to Augustine 1,000 years before cannot survive the glaring fact that there are persons in the world who just never received the gospel. And so what we see with these modern figures is an attempt to reconcile the belief that there is no salvation outside the church, which they hold to, with the real world, a world which included persons who God didn't seem to share his revelation with. So what do the moderns do? Well, some of them follow Thomas closely and say, well, these persons are going to hell. But it's not because they didn't believe the right things, because, yeah, they never really had a chance to believe the right things. It's rather just because of original sin. So they didn't do anything wrong with what they believed because they never heard about Christianity. They never heard about Jesus. But there's other reasons for God to send them to hell. This is the first response. It's a recognition that the medievals were wrong in saying everyone had heard the gospel, but nothing really happens with that recognition. There's still a willingness just to say, well, God damns them. It's unfortunate. Domingo Soto in the 16th century builds on something Thomas spoke of a couple hundred years earlier. When Thomas talks about the need for belief in Jesus to be saved, he develops an idea that first becomes apparent earlier in the medieval period, that there's two different ways to believe something: explicit or implicit belief. That is, you can say, I believe in Jesus, because somebody sat you down and read to you from a Bible and you decided you believed in it. Or, even if you don't fully understand the Christian religion, even if you've never had a full exposition of the Christian religion, you can live your life rightly. You can follow God's commands even if you don't know what all those commands are, and you can act in such a way that suggests if anyone ever did fully explain the gospel to you, you would then believe it. This is termed implicit belief or implicit faith. Soto argues that indigenous persons who follow the natural law, that is, who live in morally upright ways, in fact have implicit faith. In fact, have what he refers to as a fides confusa, literally a confused faith. They're living the right way. They're trying to follow God. Nobody ever told them, though, what exactly it means to follow God. And if they possess a faith, well, later moderns will seize onto this and say, that means they kind of do belong to the church. If they were exposed to the right things, they would believe the right things. And if they believed the right things, they'd be part of the church. So, well, they may not be, insert various scholastic definitions here, this kind of believer. They are this kind of believer. And these kinds of believers can still get saved somehow, even if we don't fully understand it. If you've ever read a legal brief, you'll notice that words get used in weird ways, and that there's a lot of fighting over what seem to be incredibly minuscule differences in language. Scholastic theology is like that, where when we talk about an explicit versus an implicit faith, when we talk about whether this kind of belonging, material versus formal belonging in the church, is enough to merit salvation, these are going to be the things that are argued about for hundreds of years, because these legalistic, these jargony differences are seen as actually being the thing which determines whether or not God saves you. So if you believe in this way or versus this way, if you don't actually ever go to a church, but you live in a way that suggests you would go to a church, these are the things that really these late medieval thinkers, these modern thinkers, try to grab onto, because they want a solution that doesn't require them to say every indigenous person is damned, but they feel like they can't just abandon the teaching of those who came before them, who said you had to be in the church in order to be saved. And so we come to Robert Bellarmine, a Jesuit thinker, also in the 16th century, who says this: I reply that saying outside the church no one is saved should be understood of those who belong to the church, neither in reality nor in desire, just as theologians commonly speak about baptism. That is, Bellarmine wanted to say that to belong to the church, you either had to be baptized or you had to want to be baptized. And in the discussion of the moderns, we'll find out that wanting to be baptized can either be an explicit want, so the catechumens, those who are trying to enter the church, are mentioned. So what happens if you're trying to get into the church? Contemporarily, we can talk about someone who's driving to the Easter Vigil and a tree falls on their car and they die. Very sad. Did they go to heaven? Early on in the medieval period, when everyone was following Augustine, no, they went to hell because they weren't baptized. But later on, thinkers like Thomas will say, well, they had the desire to be baptized, and that's sufficient. That's almost as good as being baptized. So they can go to heaven, maybe, if God's being merciful that day. So similarly, Bellarmine is saying, well, there are those who are in the church, and then there are those who want to be in the church. And maybe wanting is enough. And maybe you can want without actually wanting. So the catechumen obviously wants to be in the church because he or she is trying to get in, but maybe there are also those who just never had the opportunity to join, but would want to if they're presented with that opportunity. This idea is carried forward by a couple other Jesuits. Suarez is going to play around more with how to define those who would want to be in the church but were never given an opportunity to be the church, how to describe their membership in a body which they obviously are not members of, because they don't know what it is and because they haven't been baptized, yet who through their actions demonstrate that they do desire to follow God. They do desire to believe in God. Juan de Lugo I included here because of something very interesting that he catches on to, which shows up in some of the earlier Jesuit thinkers. One of the reasons so many Jesuits appear in this book is because it was written by a Jesuit. But another reason so many Jesuits appear in this book is because Jesuits were missionaries to the farthest reaches of the world at the end of the Age of Exploration. Francis Xavier is one of the obvious examples. But these are persons going not just to the New World, we see many Dominicans come to the New World as well, but also to India, into Southeast Asia, to some of the farthest reaches of the world, which also were not part of the Roman Empire, which also weren't part of the known world in the West. And these thinkers were again confronted with good persons trying to live their lives well, who, according to the Augustinian bent in the church's tradition, were going to hell, just because no missionary had ever reached them. So one could interpret the Jesuits' missionary zeal perhaps as their believing they had a duty to carry the gospel to persons to save them from hell, to prevent them from going to hell. But we also see the Jesuits, because of their experience with, because of their encounters with indigenous persons, trying very, very hard to make sense of how a loving God would keep these persons out of heaven. Many of them can't accept this. And so we see persons like Bellarmine, persons like Suarez, trying to take parts of the church's tradition that exists, the idea of implicit desire for baptism, and make it so that those ideas can be carried to include those persons who never had the gospel preached to them. Or, like an earlier Dominican pointed out, those persons who had the gospel preached to them poorly. If a conquistador shows up and you live in Peru, you live in Mexico, and tells you, believe in Jesus, and then treats you like a slave, or shoots someone in your family, or burns down your village, you are probably not going to believe him about his wonderful religion. And so earlier members of the tradition point out that these persons didn't have the gospel preached to them. Even if the words were spoken, it wasn't sufficient. They can't be blamed for not believing in a religion that was taught to them so poorly. De Lugo, though, says that, quote, finally, if any Jews or Turks or Muslims were invincibly in error about Christ and his divinity, there is no reason why they could not have a true supernatural faith about God, end quote. That is, this lack of preaching that is extended to indigenous persons, at least the Jesuit De Lugo, also extends to persons in other religions. Because, he says, if you're raised a certain way to think Christianity is always wrong, or to believe in your own holy text, or to rely on the authority of teachers you have surrounding you, well, that's a very good reason to no longer consider Christianity as right religion, or to ignore missionaries that might come to you and tell you to believe in Christianity. I think my computer has just died, so I'll have to see how well I can do without the benefit of my lecture notes. Moving forward out of the age of exploration, a couple of things happen. One is very important. It's the Protestant Reformation. Because the Protestant Reformation leads to the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent is an ecumenical council that basically exists to refute Protestantism and to declare the truth of the Catholic religion. And the Council of Trent is famous for having lots of declarations that, shall we say, are not exactly inviting or welcoming or loving. And the Council of Trent reaffirms, unsurprisingly, that there is no salvation outside of the church. Because the Council of Trent is primarily an apologetical document, it's trying to defend Catholicism as a religion, and so the Council of Trent is trying to argue that if you are a Protestant, if you are a Calvinist, if you are an Anglican, if you are a Lutheran, you have removed yourself from that thing which can save you. And so you need to come back to the Catholic Church, or you're not going to go to heaven. The Council of Trent does not seem to be that interested in the question of indigenous persons and whether they might be saved, whether they can have implicit desire for baptism. It is very much interested in addressing the schisms that occur in the 16th century. It's very much interested in telling Protestants they have to come back to the Catholic Church, and in threatening those Protestants with hellfire if they do not come back to the church. Again, historical context. Trent is written against something. Trent is not written to address the worries of the Dominicans and the Jesuits, who were missionaries who met persons who had never heard the gospel. Trent is instead written to, persuade Protestants to come back to the Catholic Church, and to also state why the Catholic Church is the only one true church that everyone should believe in. I'm going to skip ahead in time again, in the interest of time, and also because there's, one last major development that we need to really focus on. Because following Trent, following the Reformation, we largely see a reaffirmation of this belief that there is no salvation outside the church in a way that doesn't really consider, with some exceptions, that there might be cases in which persons were not preached the gospel well, or were never preached the gospel, or in which persons might be trying to live a good life but might have some reasons for being misled about what counts as a good life, or for being confused about what counts as a good life. The last thing that we need to talk about is the Second Vatican Council. After the First Vatican Council reaffirms much of Trent's teaching, much of the apologetic, much of the defensive teaching found in the Council of Trent, the Second Vatican Council seemingly breaks away from the entire theological tradition encapsulated and contained in both Trent and the First Vatican Council. The Second Vatican Council does, to be clear, reaffirm that there is no salvation outside of the church. But the Second Vatican Council also then clarifies what is meant by being outside of the church. Specifically, the Second Vatican Council, let's say, authoritatively states, enters into doctrine, beliefs that began appearing in the medieval period and that were carried forward into the modern period. Namely, there are ways of being a part of the church other than being baptized by a priest in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit, and then physically, orally stating that you believe in Jesus and that you accept the teachings of the church. The Second Vatican Council says there are pathways to membership in the church that go beyond these physical, material ways of becoming a member. Two that are specifically mentioned are baptism by blood and baptism by desire. In other words, there are baptisms that don't involve water being poured on your head as a sacrament. Baptism by blood is simply martyrdom, dying for a faith in Jesus. This probably wouldn't apply to most of our indigenous persons. It definitely wouldn't apply to non-Christians. However, the Second Vatican Council also speaks of baptism by desire. This is the idea that we have already seen in some of our medieval and modern thinkers, that there are persons who live their life in such a way that suggests they would convert to Christianity if they were ever told of it. Or, another version of this, there are persons who are living their lives as Christians right now, even if the church doesn't know about them and they don't know about Christianity. There are persons who live with God's love in them, who follow God's law that is written in their hearts so well that they are already Christians, even if they have never been baptized sacramentally, even if they've never wandered into a Catholic church, even if they have never been formally taught the teachings of the church. This is something that is ratified by, that is declared by the Second Vatican Council. So some of these theological ideas that were being proposed as ways of dealing with this problem that emerged in the modern period, in the age of exploration, are taken and placed into the magisterial teachings of the church, into the deposit of faith within the Second Vatican Council. I mention this because it leaves us in an interesting place. The most recent teachings of the entire church, something declared both by the Pope and by all the bishops of the church, say that there is no saving outside of the metaphorical walls of the Catholic Church. But the boundaries of those walls are expanded in a way by Vatican II that was not something that was believed by the harshest defenders, the strictest defenders of no salvation outside of the church. So where does that leave us now? There's a couple of asides that I want to engage in before I end and open up the floor for some questions. First, the boundaries of what is outside the church matter, but they're never clearly delineated. What is meant by desire? How do we gauge implicit, that is unspoken, personal want to be baptized, to become a member of the church, to hear the gospel message of Jesus? How is it that we make sense of this? What is enough of a desire? Do I need to actually one day convert, that is, be preached the gospel and declare myself a Christian? Do I have to have the sacrament of baptism, that is, the pouring of water in my head with the proper invocation? Is it enough that I merely live according to God's law, as written in my heart, the natural law that's spoken about by the medievals? Is it enough that I live out my own religion, my non-Christian religion, but do so in a way that is both compatible with God's law as revealed in the church, and also that is compatible with the teachings that I was given, mistaken though they might be in the eyes of the church? There's still ambiguity, there's still a lack of clarity about who it is that desires baptism, desires membership in the church, and what is enough of a desire to allow for salvation. The other two asides that I wanted to engage in are relevant more so to the question of whether someone goes to heaven or hell than directly to the question of whether or not there's salvation outside the church. I had a philosophy professor once who talked about how in philosophy there are no good answers, there are only less bad answers. And what I want us to think about is what might make an answer to the question, is there salvation outside the church, less bad? That is, I believe there are considerations that should push us to question whether even the solution of there's no salvation outside the church, but the church's boundary is much bigger than we thought of, is a good enough solution. So here's one problem that can be raised. The problem of universalism. I've talked about this in a previous Lonergan lecture. Whether or not there are actually persons in hell. There is a way to defend this thesis that is perfectly coherent and that is also perfectly compatible with, consistent with the teachings of the church. But if you believe in universalism, you're going to have to stretch what it means to be within the church, possibly beyond any degree of comprehension. So if you believe no one goes to heaven, but you also believe that there's no salvation outside the church, that means everyone ever has been a part of the church. Well, we definitely can confirm not everyone ever has been baptized because the sacrament of baptism has not existed for all time. We also would really have to play loose with this idea of baptism by desire, considering there was no Christian religion for a fairly long period of time. So no one could desire to be a part of the church because it didn't exist. So if you believe in universalism, if you believe an all-loving, all-merciful, all-forgiving God would not send someone to hell, which I think is a reasonable belief, well, how then do you make sense of you got to be in the church to be saved? Because it seems like some of those persons who were saved, if you believe in universalism, it's very hard to make a case that they were members of a church that didn't actually exist. Lastly, the problem of evil. I also delivered a Lonergan lecture on this. The problem that a perfect God would not let bad things happen. If you hold to the idea there's no salvation outside the church, and if you are not going to expand membership of the church to everyone, you still have persons that will perpetually suffer, that is, suffer without end in hell. How does a loving God who knows everything before it happens, who can change anything that does happen, and who wants only the best to happen, allow for even one of his children to suffer damnation? If you want to believe, if you want to accept, if you want to assent to the idea that there is no salvation outside the church, and you hold to the seemingly common sense belief that there are persons outside of the church who are not members of the church, whether explicitly or implicitly, whether formally or materially, if there's anyone outside the church and they can't be saved, you then have to address one of what I believe to be the most poignant, the most powerful iterations of the problem of evil. Why a perfect God would allow anyone to suffer that fate, to suffer the fate of eternal removal from him, but also the fate of unending punishment for the sin of being born in the wrong place, of being taught by the wrong person, of being preached to by the wrong preacher. So all of this leaves us then with a final question. God saves, but through what? This is the causation question that I raised earlier. The church teaches that the mechanism by which we're saved, even if the ultimate cause is Christ's incarnation, the mechanism by which we are saved is the church herself. Through the deposit of faith, that is the revelation of God, mediated to us through both Jesus and then the apostolic tradition, through the sacraments given to us by Jesus, mediated again through the authority vested in the bishops and priests of the church. That's what the church tells us. And that seems to be, if not the majority, then at least the favored interpretation of what no salvation outside of the church means. But that interpretation, as we've seen, is not universal. It hasn't always existed. That interpretation has faced stressors that it's struggled to accommodate, and that it has many times been, well, stretched, many times been altered to accommodate those stressors. So if we're still presented with these problems, like the problem of universalism, like the problem of evil, that lead us to question whether or not even the more expansive version of no salvation outside the church promulgated by Vatican II is sufficient, well, then I think that leaves us with one last question. What is the next development of this doctrine going to be? How is no salvation outside of the church going to be understood, removed from our historical context? When the next stressor appears, when the next development is forced, what is it that we, as 21st century Americans, are missing that prevents us from better understanding the mercy of God, as has happened consistently through the development of this teaching? God saves, but through what? What is it that we are missing if we affirm God only saves through membership in the church? Thank you. I apologize for my computer not having sufficient battery, but I assure you the last few slides were not all that interesting. If you have questions, Jules going to bring a microphone around now. Please speak into the microphone, or else people watching the live stream will not be able to hear you. And I can tell you from personal experience, it's very confusing for someone to answer a question that you didn't actually hear. So raise your hand, Jules will bring the microphone around if any of you have some questions.
So we have a God who creates all people, and we believe supposedly in original sin. That means every time a person is born, God is bringing a sinner into the world. What kind of a God is that? When we talk about This way of looking at salvation or the church, implicit, explicit, blah, 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 blah. To me, it's for self-preservation. It's a way to get people to stay in or come to an organization that doesn't make any sense, except it's theological semantics to preserve the church. As you mentioned towards the very end, that means that anybody who was born, lived, died before Christ was even incarnate, that none of them are going to go to heaven. Moses and David and all the great prophets, etc. It's a bunch of bull. I mean, let's be realistic. And to me, I appreciate your development. It helped me understand how things developed. That evolution that Cardinal Newman talked about makes a lot of sense, because each in its own proper time was understandable. Well, we're in 2026 now. We're not in the year 120 or 1245 or whatever. Let's understand God not from a church perspective, but a personal perspective. And that's just my comment. But I appreciate all the development, the evolution, helped me to understand. But to me, it's no excuse to still think that way. In this time, I think of greater evolution theologically. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Roy. So as I said, I was thinking of you at many points while I was putting together this presentation. I have a couple of comments in response. One is this. As I think all of you know, I don't consider myself a theologian. I'm not trained as a theologian, but also I don't like theology. Because it seems to me that theologians start off with the answer they have to believe, and then they work backwards to get to it. I apologize to those of you who are theologians in the audience, but that's my philosophical chauvinism. As a philosopher, though, I believe that what I get to do is look at the world, see how the world is, and then try and figure out what I should think about the world based on the stuff that's in it. And I agree with you, Father Roy, that I think that a lot of the incredibly overly complicated theology, especially the medieval scholastic theology with its Picayune distinctions, is done as a response to having started off with the belief that had to be held. The arguments over explicit versus implicit belief, the arguments over baptism of desire, whether it's done implicitly or explicitly, distinctions about belonging to this particular group which materially belongs to the church or doesn't materially belong to the church but spiritually could be included in this part of the church, it's pharisaical in the sense of what Jesus criticized among the religious leaders in his day, tying up heavy burdens without lifting a finger to help with them. If you have to try that hard for God not to send someone to hell, either Christians believe in the wrong God, our Calvinist friends have it right that we're sinners in the hand of an angry God. Maybe that's what we should all believe, and then it makes more sense. Or maybe the medievals started off in the wrong place. Maybe they got stuck with an Augustinian understanding of original sin. Yes, the church teaches there's original sin, but does the church also teach that is inherited through sexual intercourse? That was Augustine's position. Sin was passed down biologically. That is, something on our souls was passed down through physical generation of a human body. No, the church doesn't teach that anymore. But then how do we make sense of Augustinian original sin without Augustine's explanation for how it came to be in the first place? There's so much of this disagreement, there's so much of this discussion that seems to miss some of the most fundamental parts of the Christian faith as it was initially presented. And the fact that in the early church, for literal hundreds of years, there was not discussion of no salvation outside the church, I think that's something that needs to be taken much more seriously. If you want to argue that the church has this, what is the phrase that's used? An unbroken fabric, an unbroken tapestry, that is a continuity going back to Jesus and the apostles, well, then what people who were removed by a couple generations rather than a couple millennia from Jesus and the apostles said has to matter. And the fact that it takes 400 years for condemnation of non-Christians to show up, that can't be ignored. So, yes, I'm starting from a different place than the theologians are, or at least than many members of this theological tradition are. And yes, I'm starting from the place where I do historical work rather than doing apologetic work. But I think that there are historical factors that were ignored or that were dismissed for theological reasons, and also for political reasons, and also for cultural reasons. And I think that entire picture, if we don't see it in its fullness and its completeness, that impoverishes the view of God and of the church that we have, that is maintained within the Catholic Church today. I don't think that criticism only applies to a discussion of no salvation outside the church, but I think it's a very relevant one. Not to lecture too much, not to climb upon a figurative soapbox, but I think the remedy to this is real historical work. That is, don't go watch an online Bible study from, well, I won't mention the institution of higher learning that I attended, which is what I immediately thought of, but don't go to a place that is just concerned with having you believe the same thing that was believed 300 years ago. As we've seen, sometimes those things change after 300 or 600 or 1,000 or 2,000 years. But don't just go to the place that's going to tell you you have to believe this because this person back here believed it. Go to the place that tells you, well, this is what the people at the time thought, and here's why they thought it, and here's what might have affected them thinking it, and here's why the people 200 years in the future thought something different. If we're not doing that kind of legwork, that is, if we're not doing the menial work of diving into historical factors, of looking at cultural factors, of asking what in the past made this person think this thing, and we're simply saying, well, Thomas Aquinas thought this, so it must be true. But Thomas Aquinas thought wrong things according to the church. So if he could have messed up on this thing, he could have messed up on this other thing. So we need to do the work then to fully understand what was believed and why it was believed, rather than just doing the repetitive work, the rote work of saying, this is what they thought, and so credo, I believe it as well.
Yeah, to me, again, it comes down to why would God create people that he knows are going to go to hell? Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to create you over there in India. I'm going to create you over there in Nigeria. I'm going to create you over there in Hong Kong because you're going to go to hell. It just doesn't make sense in the strict interpretation of salvation outside the church. But thank you.
Other questions?
Just to point out, Josh, that Lonergan, after whom these lectures are named, is a philosophical theologian. So he lives in both worlds, lives in both of them very, very well, actually. And that he said, why do people criticize me? My work is really history. So he said that himself. My work is just history, and that's what your work is. So take it easy on the theologians. There's a contemporary theologian called Tomas Halleck. He's a Czech theologian, and he's written an extraordinary book called The Afternoon of Christianity, and he says many of the same things that you said, and as I've said, I say so all the time. There's only really one problem that we really have, and it's who is God. I mean, we confuse the God who created the universe with the God who sent Jesus, with the God who's alive in our hearts today, and I think. I've always agreed with Roy since high school. But anyway, that's really the problem is God, and I mean that's both a philosophical and a theological problem.
I think with the question of who God is, I agree that it is the central, the fundamental, and maybe the only question that at least Christianity, if not any other deity-based religion, has to answer. I think it's especially important if we want to take a biblical perspective on these questions. Many of the Gnostics in the early church, so in the first couple centuries, there were these groups these breakaway groups from the church, known as Gnostics, from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge, they believed that, well, they believed a lot of things, but generally they believed that there was special knowledge that you could only get from their groups that would lead to you being saved. They were associated in some ways with the Pelagians. They thought there was something you could do to be saved. But many of the Gnostics also believed a very interesting thing based on their understanding of the scriptures that were available to them, that there were two competing gods. There was the Jewish God in the Old Testament who was angry and who burnt people and had the ground eat them up and sent snakes to eat them too. And then there was a more loving God that Jesus represented. And I bring this up because I think it's a very good example of this tension between these different viewpoints of God. In the philosophical literature, you will see discussions of the God of the philosophers and the God of the Bible, because there's a recognition that this vision of God philosophy has had for hundreds of years, this perfect, this omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent being, doesn't show up in the Bible anywhere. Those words aren't biblical terms. When God changes his mind about destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, when Abraham pleads with him, when God changes his mind about destroying Israel, when Moses pleads with him, this is not an immutable God. This is not an impassionate God. And so all these different, not versions, these different ways of seeing God, these different perspectives on God very much drive, I believe, the philosophical and theological problems that we have today. Because there's no unified understanding of God, because if the theologians are right and God is completely beyond our ability to understand him, if God is truly a mystery, his nature is a mystery to us, well then, yes, we're going to endlessly be fighting over, well, this is the way we should see God. No, this is the way we should see God. Because if we can't actually see God now, well, then there's always going to be mistakes in the ways that we struggle to see him. Other questions? Thank you, everyone.